So can we do the shoulder so we can kind of crank?
Gloria, do you want to stand to Violet?
Yes, Gloria in the middle.
Accordion style.
You in the middle next to Gloria Violet, please. You big rouge where we're facing.
Oh, you should be here and then I'll be on the other side.
Okay, so you extend it across.
That was really good. Okay, if you guys can just come just a little bit back in, right here. All right, 1, 2. One more time. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jose Rodriguez. I'm a feature film programmer here at the festival, and it's my pleasure to be here and to introduce this amazing event, this amazing moderator, these amazing panelists, this very special Tribeca Talks, speaking in codes, storytelling that codifies gender equitable systems in China and in the US. When we kind of brainstorm kind of ideas of what kind of conversations we want to foreground, the kind of happy accidents are when films that we have at the festival tie in nicely with the conversation, and this is one such situation where we have this amazing film, Hidden Letters, directed by Feng, and it just made perfect sense to have an extension of the conversation that Violet's film explores, and bring amazing women to discuss this great topic. We're gonna go for like an hour or so, and hopefully you all will have amazing questions to ask these amazing panelists. But I wanna bring up first to the front your amazing moderator and a Tribeca Film Institute supported alum, a Tribeca alum, a great storyteller, Malika Zuhali-Worrell. Malika Zuhali-Worrell is yes, applause. No? Ah, come on.
Where should I sit?
If you want, whatever is most, yeah. She's an amazing filmmaker, and we're proud to have her. Enjoy.
Thank you, Jose. It's such a pleasure to be here, and welcome. I'm gonna take this off while I talk. Welcome to this Tribeca Talk, Speaking in Codes. My name's Malika Zuhali-Worrell. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm 39 weeks pregnant, so I'm probably going to read a lot because I maybe can't remember everything. So I want to make sure to do everyone justice. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderating today's conversation, which has been organized around the Tribeca Festival premiere of the brilliant film Hidden Letters. I want to quickly thank the sponsors of this panel, InMat, ITVS and Independent Lens, and Chicken and Egg. And I'm thrilled to first bring up the director of Hidden Letters, an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, Violet Feng. And is this good? And I'm also delighted to introduce our other panelists, poet, performer, and educator, Sarah Kay. Poet, feminist organizer, political theorist, and journalist, Robin Morgan. And last but very much not least, of course, writer, lecturer, activist, and feminist icon, Gloria Steinem. So while everyone's getting settled, I just wanted to share that we're going to have a conversation about the film, and 10 minutes before the end of the panel, I'm also going to open it up to questions, and we'd love to hear any thoughts you all have had as a result of watching the film and as a result of this conversation. So, just in case there's anyone here who hasn't yet had a chance to see the film, and I think there are more screenings coming up, Violet, is that right? Hidden Letters tells the story of generations of women in China who, over thousands of years, developed a secret language in order to communicate with each other and find both solidarity and independence in an intensely patriarchal society. Invented secret languages are a technique that women, marginalized genders, and various other oppressed communities have employed over and over again in history to resist oppression since time immemorial. And it's fascinating to see the Nushu activists in your film, Violet, trying to keep the language alive while vying with some of the same patriarchal oppressive systems in present-day China that previous generations were dealing with. I'm wondering if you could maybe first tell us about how you first learned about Nushu and started working on this film, but also what challenges you yourself met in the process of both making and releasing the film.
Yes. So I first heard about Nushu, I think it was around 2005. I read a book by Lisa C called Snowflower and the Secret Feng. It was a novel based on Nushu. I remember reading the book and telling myself that how could I not know this? As a woman born and raised in China, I've never heard of it. So I was really fascinated by it. And then fast forward to 2010, I got relocated back to China and lived there for 7 years. That was the time that I got married and had a child, had a baby. And, I grew up in a time, in more of a communist era when gender equality was very much pushed. And I was more raised by my dad, who always pushed me to dream higher and even higher than a boy. And so I always thought that, I have no limit of what I wanted to pursue. So I came to the US for graduate school. I started to making films. And all of a sudden, I was in China and I had a baby. And I felt that the whole society's expectation for me totally changed 180 degrees to all fall on me to be a good mom and a good wife, and that sense of such traditional virtues is all like reintroduced, and I don't know where it comes from. It caught me in a place that I feel so stifled, and not just me and all the girls, my girlfriends around me were feeling the same. Then I started to ponder on this of how the economic boom China has gone through and become so more capitalistic, and how that has expanded the huge gender wage gap and then kind of pushed women back in their family roles. And at the same time, the government is trying to revive the traditional DNA of China by kind of like reintroducing all the traditional values and all of those. So in a way that I feel women are all caught in that place without a space to talk about it. So when my two producers, Mette and Montikas, who's here actually from Norway, and Jing Chen came to me and wanting me to make a film about Nushu, I instantly thought that if there's a way I can connect that story to the contemporary stories of where women are, where I was, maybe I will have a fascinating story, and maybe in that process I can find my own answer as where I want to be, both as a filmmaker, as a mom, and as a Chinese woman.
And I know that even the process of releasing the film has created some challenges for you, especially in China. Are you able to share anything on that, or not right now?
Sure, I can. I think we have a distributor in China, and then we're in the process of getting it released in China. But of course, there are difficulties about releasing a film like this in China. But after producing for so long, like 15 to 20 years, I always wanted to tell stories that can connect both the East and the West. And I really want the story to be seen in China, because I know that this is what we're all stifled in this together, and want women in China to be able to see this film. So that really actually affected me from the beginning of making this film, of what kind of cinematic language I wanted to use to make this film so that it can be seen in China, but also it can have a universal access for people outside of China. So I mean, call me greedy, but that's really, I wanted to achieve that. So I think also there's a parallel of the language of Nushu and what conditions and context those women were living under, and how they find their way and approach creatively to find their safe space. And I thought that, okay, that must be something that is going to be my cinematic language in this as well. So like, like the film itself will become a space, a safe space to allow women even today, inspired by women in the past, to be in here, be vulnerable together, and be able to share our authentic and honest self. And that becomes a starting point of a conversation I think can negotiate with the dominant authorities and social structure, and that's exactly what those women in the past did.
Wonderful, thank you. I think something that's so clear from the film is the fact that all language is political, and language can very much be used both to oppress and to empower people. Sarah, as a poet and as a poet who's worked in education and organizing in various parts of the world, I'm wondering if you could just share how you think about the political nature of language, and maybe if there's any specific experiences you've had that kind of parallel Nushu.
Sure. So I was really moved by this film and struck by exactly what you're saying, the way that language can be both a weapon and an act of love, and a radical tool. And I have gotten a chance to do a lot of work in Asia, although not in China yet. But I have done a lot of work in Nepal, and that's the space that I'm probably the most familiar with the power of women poets and the way that language is incredibly politicized, and how what can be at stake for poets can be very different depending on who you are and where you are in the context you find yourself in. So just as an example, there's a group of young women poets in Nepal that I've worked with for many years, and when they were in their 20s, they started a group called the Word Warriors, and it was a group dedicated to creating workshops and poetry events for young people, and specifically marginalized young people. And in Nepal, a lot of young people are oftentimes like trilingual. Nepali is the language of the state, the official language that you would learn in school, but oftentimes at home, people are more likely to be communicating in like their family's language. And then often a lot of them are also learning English in their schools as well. And however, historically, the language of literature and poetry is specified as Nepali. And not only that, but you really are only expected to write poetry about really specific topics. And so these young women were writing poems in the language they speak at home, in English, sometimes mixing languages in one poem, and then also the topics that they write about are not traditional topics. In Nepal is also a really patriarchal society with a lot of domestic violence. The leading cause of death for women between the ages of 15 and 49 is suicide in Nepal. And that context is just what people live in, but they don't explicitly discuss it. And so to have young women writing about these issues in the language that they really communicate in and standing on stages and sharing them, like people lost their minds. Like men freaked out and were like, "You're ruining literature. They have to be stopped." And it was just to see the urgency of that art, and the impact of then watching what happens when other young women see those poets share their own art, and kind of make that path possible, continues to be such a lesson in what can be at stake, and how vital, even what seems like a small choice of what language you're using, and what you're writing about and to whom you're speaking, is just so much more, just so much more volatile, I think, than people often realize when they think of poetry.
Absolutely. Another thing that I was particularly struck by in Hidden Letters was this intergenerational conversation that's explored in a number of ways. One way is one of the young women working to keep Nushu alive has incredible conversations with an elder who actually remembers when Nushu was used actively, and also sometimes seems to be more radical than the younger women in the film. I absolutely loved her. And then there's other moments when one of the young women is writing across generations and writing back to ancestors. We're very lucky to have another poet and writer and activist on the panel, Robin Morgan. Robin, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about, based on your experiences in the international women's movement, but also I believe you also have created work that's writing across generations, in your case writing to women in the future, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, and I have to say right off the bat that I am an unabashed fan of Violet and this team and this film. I mean, really, I think it's an extraordinary work, and I will do anything I possibly can to promote it. As an activist, it's very good for women, but as a poet and an artist, it is. I don't want to muss up your categories here. I mean, I know it's in the documentary category, but it's a work of art. It is just an exquisite, remarkable film. So, and it's anybody so young could have done something this profound. Blew me away. Yeah, in the 80s, when Nushu was first discovered by Chinese scholars, I read a small 1-inch clip in the New York Times about it, and was blown away then, because the idea of women writing in code about sisterhood struck me as the most amazing metaphor for everything that we are doing in the West, in the East, in the North, and the South. And the concept that men could not understand it. I mean, women wrote in Nushu because they weren't allowed to write in Mandarin or in any other form of Chinese, but also because it was so cherished, it was so precious, it was buried with them. And these are not joyous, happy poems. These are stories of anguish and terror and pain and transcendence at the same time, which is what makes them, I think, so extraordinarily useful. Writing in code was unique in my experience. I knew about women working in code for sisterhood across lines in the global women's movement. In the Palestinian women in embroidery would embed the Palestinian colors, which were at that point illegal. The Aboriginal women have mapped, in Dreamtime songs, ways of navigating the desert. Arpilleras in Chile were code during the military regime, the junta, for how to navigate the underground. And for that matter, in the American South, quilting, enslaved women, quilting and the lyrics to spirituals were all code for how to make your way to freedom. So that wasn't that new. It was always impressive, and it was amazing to rediscover it. But and to discover it intergenerationally, I might add as well, because that's like another culture as well. So, but what was amazing was to find that it was an entire language. A language, and language is my tool. Language is the way, you can do jargon about politics, you can do rhetoric, but if it's art, it just goes right under the radar and goes right to the heart. So that's where the Nushu poem, if I sit beside a well, I don't thirst, and if I sit beside a sister, I don't despair. So when I saw this film, I just was blown away all over again, and I congratulate you and all of the women who worked with you, and the men. Xie xie, mei mei.
If you have something to add, Gloria, please do. I have a question for you, but if you wanted to,
by all means, ask me the question.
There are also a number of absolutely astounding moments in Hidden Letters, Violet, where you really capture, and somehow you're really present for moments where you see how there is an active attempt to co-opt, rebrand, commercialize Nushu, and you can literally, it's so absurd that you can really see how it either consciously or unconsciously will have the impact of neutralizing this radical subversive language and probably even changing the message of it. For anyone who hasn't seen the film, there's a moment when people are considering branding golden chopsticks. There's an iPhone involved. There's even one suggestion to use Nushu to help the potato industry. But it really, really struck me because I think that's something we deal with everywhere. As if you're involved in any kind of activist or radical movements, you see how when they enter the mainstream, there's often very kind of conscious efforts to subvert them or rebrand them or change the message. And Gloria, I was wondering if, as someone with so much experience around these things, I wonder if you could talk about that technique of co-optation and the neutralizing of radical movements and how you've contended with that.
Well, we just have to keep right on doing whatever the fuck we think we should be doing and not allow ourselves to be neutralized. But actually, Nushu was introduced to me long ago the first time in a great way because Wilma Mankiller, the chief of the Cherokee Nation, had been to China, and she brought back an example of Nushu, embroidered example, which I thought must say some great feminist thing. Actually, it was in praise of the emperor, as it turned out. But nonetheless, it was a great example. And I think the very moving message to me was, you may travel, you may go to school in ways we cannot, but we can write in a language you cannot understand. It was such a deep and wonderful rebellion. Now we are all writing in a language that most of us understand. But I think the rebellion of adjectives and pronouns is still with us very much, and we still need it, not to mention the sheer quantity of who is heard. I mean, I suppose the internet has helped somewhat, but certainly not completely. And we are still disqualified by adjectives, I think. That this is women's writing, not, do we say it's men's writing? No, right? So it's a great example of the global nature of our struggle against patriarchy and racism and all the ways that we are divided by adjectives instead of being allowed to be the unique individuals that each of us is and is born unique, somebody who never happened before, could never happen again, and the global community that we have to learn from. And thanks to this work, we are able to learn that, in a way that we would not have been without it.
And it's a hell of a good cry. Just rivers and rivers and rivers. Just so beautiful. So true.
I also wanted to add something quickly about the co-opting, and the reason I kind of included all of that in the film is, the moment that I realized of the level of co-opting that they're doing in Yushu, and unsurprisingly, mostly by men, I started to realize it's a metaphor itself. Yushu is the last thing and the only thing that women created for ourselves for expressions, and even that is being taken away. And the parallel of that is just set so much higher stake as, we as women, what we have been taken away to be ourselves, to pursue our identity. And that's why in those scenes, I wasn't really trying to focus on, it is absurd of the level of commodification, but what I was really trying to focus on is through those lenses to help people see what men's perspective are still on women, and how do we fight against that which is so present everywhere. And it's just like idea of where men still think women are and present themselves in such a way is something that I felt is so precious to be seen in these kind of co-opting scenes.
I think the other thing that was so clear is that the young women who are working so hard to kind of share this language and raise awareness of it and keep it alive are caught within this catch-22 of, in order to do that, they have to work, they're working within a system where ultimately the gatekeepers and the people with power are men or people very invested in the patriarchal system. So it kind of felt like a moment where you see the limits of where they can go with their work, and you know, I felt like that reminded me of situations that many storytellers deal with, not least also in the US, where people who are non-white or non-cis male storytellers often can reach a point where they're struggling to get their work made if it doesn't fit into the profit-driven and frankly very patriarchal system of distribution and financing. I'm wondering, Violet, if you could talk about how you made this film, who supported it, and what you see or what you think needs to happen to create a more equitable world of storytelling.
I want to share one quick anecdote story. That was when I just moved back to China, and I got plugged into the Chinese film industry, especially the nonfiction part. And I remember there was one event, one of my producers, Jing Chen, was actually with me, and it was a Chinese indie doc event. And on the panel, it was all men. Everybody was sitting there, and there was an audience, female, asking, how come there's no female sitting on there? And one of the prominent industry leader actually said, well, they just have to work harder to get on here. And that moment, I was like, what? And since then, I made a commitment because I knew that, China, the film industry is so different, but we have no market, first of all, but also like the industry is very male dominant, and I know that how hard it is for a woman in that kind of system to try to navigate and find their own voice. It's just non-existent. We have no support, nothing. So I made a commitment to support first-time female filmmakers from China because as a producer, and I felt like that's the quickest and most efficient way for me to elevate their voices, helping them find their voice because it's so needed. And that's what I have been doing for, almost 15 years. But there's a secret reason behind it is I also felt like maybe I'm just not good enough to direct as a woman too, and that kind of fear stayed with me. And, coming out, before I moved to China, I was making films here, working with male directors, and I thought that maybe just secretly when I was helping female directors, I felt maybe just I'm not good enough, that kind of fear, very typical woman, until the moment that my producer reached me to do this film, and I was like, if those women didn't operate their decisions based on fear, and they could find something creative and different, they can find their own voice, and I can too. So I decided that will be the film that I'm going to direct.
Amazing. And is there anything, in order to make this film, I just wonder if you could share a little bit, like who supported the film, and how do you think those systems operate in relation to kind of mainstream, very profit-driven kind of streaming platforms and so on, or subscriber-driven streaming platforms?
So along the way, I was supported by so many people, and first and foremost, my producer Mette Montikas, who is here from Norway. She's the one who actually approached me for the film, and she's actually half Chinese. It was actually because of her mom, who's from Shanghai, my hometown, pushed her for so many years to make this film. And the journey of us together is sisterhood. It's absolutely sisterhood. There's also Jing Chen and also Soo Kim, who's here, who are all my producers. And I just found out throughout making this film, I got so much supporters who just believed in me and believed that, I can find my voice. Founders like Imad, Independent List, Chicken and Egg, many other Sundance IDA, Dog Society, Jonathan Logan Foundation, and what else? I'm sure we have so many funders. But I think the level of support I got is people believe that it's okay that I can find an independent voice here, because I know it's really, really hard to navigating a dominant sort of like narrative that's actually very male driven or male gaze, even in our doc world, and to find an access into a film that's female, which means more nuance, more subtle, because I think it's more powerful, and also because, it's just harder for us to be black and white in certain ways. So I felt like I got so much support to let myself embrace in that kind of voice that I believe in. And that's just, I think it's very different from where the landscape is of where, all the streamers are looking for. But yeah.
Great, thank you. Sarah, I'm wondering if, as a poet and who is very immersed in the poetry community, I'm curious what observations you had or what the film revealed to you about, like, both the role of poetry, but also how that relates to the community you're involved in, and it also even these questions about the connection or disconnection between profit incentives and art making.
Well, yeah, I don't know a lot of people who get into poetry to make a profit. I wish them the best of luck. But I do think that maybe because of that, as I said, people find their way to poetry and build lives around poetry for so many different reasons. And poetry allows people to do a lot depending on, the role it plays in the culture and society that they're a part of. I know that's a very general statement, but I have found it to be true. And there might be something about the fact that there isn't an expectation of making a profit on poetry that provides, there's certainly still co-opting and it's not that no one tries to make money off of poetry, that does happen. But I do think that there's perhaps a little bit of wiggle room, therefore, in the art for people to be looking for something else, and to be looking for kinship, to be looking for language for what feels unlanguageable, to be looking for, connection and survival through suffering, right? Like all of that is what people often turn to poetry for. And I also think that there's something about the intergenerational relationships that I have found in poetry spaces that it just seemed so resonant to me in watching this film that in my own life I started going to poetry open mics when I was 14, and most of the poets there were at least a decade older than I was, and now I'm old, and there are poets significantly younger than me who I look up to and whose work I read and study, and there is something about that exchange of communication in a poetic space that I have witnessed as tremendously powerful and important. And I wonder if just like not having a constant profit-based calibration and hierarchy allows for a different value possibility. Again, in an ideal way, it doesn't always work out that way, obviously, but at least sometimes I have gotten to witness that work. And so getting to watch in this film the way that these women of different generations communicated with each other, both living, live communication, and then also watching the young woman write Nushu in communication with an ancestor who's no longer alive, also felt like, this is poetry is a form of communication, and to be able to use that form of communication to communicate across time is also, maybe one of the ways we can communicate across time. I don't know a lot of other ways that we can do it, but I think that's one of them. So I don't know if that is all just rambling now, but that's what I was thinking about when I was watching the film.
No, that's wonderful, and actually I feel like that's an interesting segue to Robin. I believe you've also written across time and written to communicate with future generations.
Yes, after being blown away by Nushu the first time around in the 80s, I did a long essay, the title essay, in fact, in one of my books called The Word of a Woman, and the essay is a Nushu letter written to women 1,000 years in the future, and I deliberately instructed the printer to set it with wide margins so that in the Chinese tradition the reader could fill in marginalia and comment on the text. But that's the kind of impression that it made on me. But I was thinking also that it's a very fine line that we all walk between winning and being co-opted. And sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference. Sometimes it's very easy to tell the difference when they're coming at you with golden chopsticks, this. But sometimes, and this film is so remarkable because the nuance in it and the subtlety in it is extraordinary. So what do we do in those moments when we're balancing on that tightrope? And I think there's probably no blueprint for it. I think two things off the top of my head. One is that poetry is inherently less corruptible. And I don't mean by that it should congratulate itself, but it is just, for all the reasons you mentioned, that there aren't scads of people lining up to see it and abandoning the latest Tom Cruise movie to go to a poetry reading with the other 11 people. It is inherently less corruptible. But on the other hand, it carries such force and power that it is like gelignite. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous force, as Wallace Stevens pointed out. So I don't know what we do about co-optation, but I know that it's a case-by-case decision, and we can't just make it a blueprint, and we have to maneuver it very carefully, politically around those barriers, and for the rest, just hope, and do the best work we can, and just do the best work we can. What would you say?
Well, I was just thinking how concentrated poetry is. It's just such a miracle. If you poured water on a poem, it would become a novel. And
Yeah.
Okay. But I so appreciate that because it enables us to carry it with us, to memorize it even at older ages where memory is a problem. Yeah, right. That to me is a big part of its magic and its power, that it is so concentrated.
It's a distillation process, I think, because it's densified. And the reason that I reacted the way that I did about a novel is not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is in itself a thing. It's not just en route to becoming something else. And although the novel form is another art form, but Violet said to me at one point when I was enthusing about the incredible subtlety in the film, the way that at one point I don't want to do spoiler alert, but the way at one point that one of the suitors of one of the two major young women seems such a great guy at the beginning. He just seems like, oh wow, he's a keeper. And then not so much anymore. But it's done very subtly. There's nothing. He's not a baddie. He's not a villain. And Violet said, well, partly that was to escape the censors. But whether it was for a tactical reason or an aesthetic reason or both, most likely, it works. And the other subtleties in the film, the look on the face of the elder woman when presented with iPhones, is priceless. And so many other moments in the film. So it is an exercise in subtlety and in nuance that I cannot imagine at this point in history a male filmmaker making. I just can't. Yeah, unfortunately.
I think one other thing, I think everyone is so struck by the elder, and I'm sorry, can you remind me her name, Violet? Ho Yan-xing. She's just such a wonderful character, and you fall in love with her so deeply, and you're so happy that that the young women, or the young woman in particular, has her to speak with, and as a sounding board, and as maybe someone to radicalize her further. And I think it was her, I believe it was her, who also spoke about the certain types of gender equality that were formally introduced with the communist revolution, and kind of she talks about them in a way that makes you wonder, like, is she talking about them in contrast to the present day that these young women are living? And then also just the fact that you can tell she has a different mindset to the young women. It just made me think a lot about, and to be fair, that the young women are operating within what seems like a pretty difficult environment, as we discussed. And it kind of made me think about the situation in the US currently, where we're seeing it feels like we're seeing major rights that we thought had been established and set in stone being rolled back, many scary things, whether it's around trans rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, reproductive rights, civil rights, and so on. So I'm actually wondering, Robin and Gloria, whether there's anything you want to, as people who've probably seen ebbs and flows and cycles and regression and progression, I'm just wondering if there's anything you could share with us about how to not exist in despair in this moment, and how to have hope and believe that we can do something about this.
Robin is saying I have to go first. Well, I think one thing that's helpful is to remember that bad news is news, and generally speaking, good news is not. So if you look at the overall support for, say, reproductive freedom, reproductive rights, not only popular acceptance of it, which is hugely increased, but access to it, even as in the state of Texas you have to travel to get it. Nonetheless, it is profoundly different from where we started, which was a state of illegality for abortion, having to travel to Mexico, to a different country, to find a doctor who was questionable and perhaps sexually aggressive in addition to being a doctor. It's probably helpful to have us oldies around to tell you how much worse it was before, but this is not ever to say that we don't share our vision of a day in which we, whatever our adjective of gender or race or class or whatever it is, that we govern our own selves, and that is the fundament of democracy, not voting on what somebody else says we should vote on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I will be frank with you, I'm quite terrified. And I have my despondent crashes that friends know about. I have this podcast in which I'm forever rooting people onward. But I have my moments where I just sort of sit and stare and weep. And in those moments, where I seek refuge is, in fact, in the profundity of art, because it lasts, because it's always there, because it will return, and because in it nests politics and everything else. So I'm very afraid in this country at this point, because I do feel that fascism is one breath away. I don't know if you watched the hearings Thursday night, and they're continuing today, and that's a great thing, at least. But we need more of this. We need more hidden letters. We need more daring works that cross genres, and so they are aesthetically profound documentaries, and they are docu art, and they are, in other words, that don't obey categorization of any sort and any kind, and are just audacious, and we need those to inspire us and to keep us going, because that's the only thing ultimately that we have. Certainly I should speak just for myself, that I have not the rhetoric and not the jargon and not the words ending in TION and ISM, but the stuff itself. When I could travel more and could go to the field, could go into the Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza Strip, could go into the rice paddies in the Philippines, could go into the favelas in Brazil, that's where I found my leadership, and could follow it in my own country, as well as recommending it, whatever support could be given to women in those countries. Since it's very difficult for me to do that now, it comes through books, it comes through films, it comes through art, it comes through connecting. And that I urge you to, if you don't know it already, and if you do, redo it, to reconnect with, because it's the only thing that will really keep you going. And that they can't get into. That is the language, exactly as Gloria quoted earlier from Nushu. They can travel, they can do all these big manly things, but we can communicate in a language they cannot understand. And I'm sorry that they cannot understand it, and I hope the day comes when they will learn to understand it, but until they do, that we can communicate in it is the salvation.
And I would just add, because by accident I've just come from Oklahoma and ceremonies for Wilma Mankiller, who was the chief of the Cherokee Nation, that we have a vertical history here that we don't learn about. I mean, we generally start when Columbus showed up or when patriarchy started or whatever it is, but we are here on Mannahatta Island.
And Oklahoma was Sequoia, the state that never was.
It is kind of mind-changing, mind-opening to think that we start history, generally speaking, so late in our study, and that there is so much before that, including here on Mannahatta.
Absolutely, thank you. I feel like now's a good time to maybe open it up to the audience and here's some questions if anyone has them. Since I have the mic and we're not passing mics around, I'll repeat your questions so that everyone can hear it.
Could we have the house lights up to half?
Oh yeah,
That would be
can we
really
turn the
lovely.
house lights up a little?
Because then we could see people.
So there we go. Great,
Ah.
thank you.
People, right.
Yeah, any questions for anyone on the
Answers.
panel about, yes, there we go.
Answers too, right?
Hi, good afternoon. It's an incredible honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Mona Das. I'm a state senator from Washington State. We have 50% women in our Senate. We have 57% women in our House. We have a male governor, and we're a very liberal state. And I found, being a woman, one of the only women of color in the legislature, it was a very racist, sexist, misogynistic place, including in the Senate caucus. And I called it out publicly, and it was very lonely. And I just want to know from any of you, how do we continue, especially with the verdict that's, potential with the Roe v. Wade and, passing the ERA. I mean, we've been trying to do that forever. So I'd love to hear thoughts and advice for, women who are in the struggle and really trying to be leaders in this space. It's lonely. It's lonely to be the first.
Thank you, Senator. It's Mona Dust.
Mona Dust, yeah.
Yes, so if, I assume everyone heard, because I guess senators are very good at speaking up. But the senator's speaking from Washington State and was speaking about their experience in a legislature that's actually 50-50 in terms of gender parity, but it's still a very misogynist space. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question.
I mean, my question is how do we move forward? How do we keep going, right?
How
we
do
need to
we
pass ERA. We need to make sure Roe v. Wade doesn't get overturned. How do we do it?
Yes, how do we move forward? And how do we do it? It's a magical question.
Why people are looking at me.
I guess, are there any words of encouragement you would want to share with the senator?
Behavior, I would say behavior is very crucial, and sometimes we forget because we're looking up all the time at what we're being told to do as opposed to what we really are doing. So something like 1 in 3 American women has needed an abortion at some time in her lifetime and had an abortion at some time in her lifetime. So behavior is often not sufficiently different maybe, but importantly different from what we see as normalization, especially in Congress and state legislatures where we are subject to rules of the game that are not necessarily rules from the bottom up.
And I would add to that, I think we just have to begin to reconsider and plunge back into massive civil disobedience. More audacity, more, I don't give a flying fuck what you think, brother. We really have to do this at some point. We've been, I hesitate to say we've been nice, because we haven't been that nice. But we've been relatively nice for quite a while. And this is out of hand now. It's been out of hand for some time. So what is different now, and Gloria will certainly also attest to this because she's been out in the hustings, is that there is much more unity among movements. There was still a time for younger people who don't remember it, when the civil rights movement was in competition with the women's movement, was in competition with La Raza, was in competition with Asian American organizing, which was kept very, very quiet because it was the model minority. Everybody was in competition of fighting over a few crumbs while the white straight male was sitting up there laughing. So now that's not the case so much. People really do come out for each other. And I think we've got to call on people to do that and do the same in response and really push the envelope, because time is short for the planet, and for democracy it's even shorter.
Thank you.
I know I'm a younger member of this panel, and I don't have advice on something as big as the work that you're doing, but I would say that part of what poetry offers me is that a lot of times it allows me to find siblinghood in language that I did not have access to otherwise. So if I'm experiencing something that feels overwhelming and unlanguageable, there's nothing better than finding a poem where someone found the words for me, and I go, thank you, you found them. And then I get to sit with that poem, and what a gift that I get to sit with. Or if someone I know is going through something, the most meaningful thing is when I can go, this is the poem, you need this poem right now. But what it has taught me is that siblinghood can be found across so many superficial boundaries. I can read a poem written by someone I ostensibly have absolutely nothing in common with, and find siblinghood in their suffering, in their survival, in their language choice. And so I know that when it does feel lonely to be the first, sometimes it is helpful to think that there is no way that I am the first, and there are other people whose struggle perhaps looks different superficially, but in their work, in their values and their priorities, in the way that they communicate, there is a siblinghood that is available to me. And so I think seeking out that guidance, both like across time and space and language and borders, and all of these things is a way to find strength, even when it's wrapped in a package that you weren't expecting to find it in.
I also really want to add that I may just make one small film, and the solution that we're trying to create from the film may not be, reach out to everybody, but we have an ambitious impact goal that through this film, we want to also revive a global sisterhood on social media. And living on that platform, we want to share the legacy and the spirit of Nushu. We want to encourage women from all territories, all cultural, all language backgrounds to express what they dare not to express in different format of arts, be it poetry, be it painting, be it music, be it graffiti. And we really wanted to hold tight of all these art pieces and then bring that all together so that we have a space for all women to share their voices. And we wanted to create a virtual gallery, and that's our statement of global sisterhood. And you guys all got a bookmark, and there's a QR code on it. That's the starting point of joining us in our amazing virtual gallery.
Wow, amazing. I think we may, I haven't been told to stop, so I think we have time for one more question. Yes, down here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the Tribeca Festival for putting this panel together. My name is Silvina Sterin. I'm from Latin America, from Argentina. I live here in New York. And I have a question. I'm not sure if it's a question or a reflection, but I would like to have your input, your take on what this opportunity that we have as women fighting for abortion rights, that the massacres, for example, the latest one in Texas, Uvalde, presents, where we can totally agree, I think, that the mask of these Republicans who are so enamored with their guns completely has fallen down, right? Because they say they are pro-life, but then when they have 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, even 6-year-olds, like in Sandy Hook, we realized they couldn't care less for life. So how can we, as reporters, activists, feminists, just take the most advantage of that mask that we see on the floor, that lie exposed, that really clarifies that the pro-life movement, at least as a flag for them, is not real.
Okay, so the question was about in the fight for reproductive freedom, and specifically around abortion right now, how can we kind of really emphasize that even the phrase pro-life is a false way of describing people who are anti-abortion, especially given the reactions, or given the fact that there are mass school shootings, such as the tragic events in Uvalde happening, where it becomes very clear that Republicans and anti-abortion folks don't seem to care that those are happening.
It's like they are anti-women, they are not pro-life.
Right.
I just wrote a blog called The Gun and the Fetus, which is precisely about that. I mean, and I'm not the first at all to point out that they have always, anti-reproductive rights people have always reserved their reverence for life to life in the fetal form. The minute it's born, and oh my God, it needs attention, food, education, warmth, love, affection, home, shelter,
Safety.
abandoned, totally abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
I congratulate you in Argentina because you're way ahead of us on abortion. And you fought very hard, very long for that. So I think that's a new model now. The only good thing I see in this situation is that the United States has been humbled by women in other countries who have achieved reproductive rights in so many different ways, and other rights that we haven't, that maybe it will take away some of that crust of national supremacy that we labored under for so long. So it's good that we approach the international movement now with more humility, but we need to. Yeah, we were going to add something.
No, I was just thinking when you were first speaking that it's important to underline that we mean, when we say pro-choice, the right to have children as well as not to have children, because it is very often interpreted in the negative, and that doesn't allow for all the changes and support that we need to allow women to have to give birth in safety and equality, and with all the care we need, which in this country, without a socialized medicine, we really don't have. It's still very differential.
That cognitive dissolve, I'm sorry, that cognitive contradiction that they get into of being pro-life, except, and for that matter, surrogacy. We just lost a battle in New York State over commercial surrogacy. I'm not talking altruistic surgery, it was a sister of somebody, but commercial surrogacy. And we lost that battle. So when they want you to have a child, that's one thing. When they don't want you to have a child, that's another thing. When they don't, I mean, it is about power and male power, and that's what it comes down to, very simply. So until that's crushed, you see the problem.
It's interesting because it's also about language, because
Well, of
they've
course.
managed to,
Yeah.
somehow they've managed to get everyone to refer to them as pro-life, which is completely inaccurate. So
Well,
it's
there just was a piece in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw it, 2 days ago, about the way that woman has disappeared now from the discussion about abortion. How it is now the chic fad thing to refer to pregnant people, or to chest feeding, but not to woman. And so, what does that do to language? What does that do to reality? What does that do to 50 years of struggle just on Roe, and that's only Roe. So there's many ways in which language can be, reconfigured to be 1984 in a sense. War is slavery, and it's up to us, poets, and we're not the legislators of the world. Sorry, Shelley, but I wish we were.
Well, I'm being given the signal to wrap up, and I just wanted to thank all of you, Gloria, Robin, Sarah, Violet, and Violet especially. Thank you for such a beautiful, beautiful film. Can you just share where people can see it next?
We have one more screening tomorrow at 6:45 at Village East. Please come, and please also spread out the word that we turn on the virtual options so people outside of New York, if they wanted to see it, they can buy virtual ticket and then watch it at home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.